I'm from Churches of Christ in Queensland, a mission department in particular. I work as a mission action partner for the mission division. And so we're involved in a whole lot of different social and community outreaches. A couple of my colleagues are involved specifically in working with people, farmers who are victims of the drought. So I've heard from that what it's like and how much they are suffering. I was thinking about that. Dean and I have been close to a number of different natural disasters. We were actually ringed by fires in Black Saturday. We come up here and within 12 months there's the 2011 floods and Cyclone Yasi. So I feel like I've lived through my share of disasters, and drought, not quite. I want to talk today, follow on from the theme of yesterday's conference of Don't Give Up. And we heard yesterday from Jenny Campbell and the challenges she had with her family and with severe illness, as well as a couple of high-achieving daughters. If I think about this in terms of how do we get through really difficult times, I turn to my own experience. And so I'm not making any apologies. A lot of what I've got to say today is actually based on things that Dean and I have experienced through our lifetimes. But it's through those things we learn. And it's through those things that we actually find that nugget of gold through the deep, dark times that help us to move on. So I want to talk about a few of those experiences. I want to talk about how I've struggled to make sense of those things as we've gone through, and I'm hoping that there's a message for each of you in terms of the things that you might have going on in your life, whether it is drought, whether it is personal tragedy, whether it is just tough stuff in life. Each year at Christmas time, we go down south to spend Christmas with our family in Melbourne. And the photos there date to 20th of January 2017. Let me paint the picture. We're just packing up, ready to come home, back to work. Our children who we've gone to visit are already back at work. Melbourne, though, is still in holiday mode because they had another week before schools go back and before offices are full again and people are back on board. So the city is full of bargain shoppers and back-to-school shoppers getting those last-minute things they needed to do. The Maya Christmas windows are a really big thing down there, and it was the last opportunity before the windows closed down for another year for parents to bring their kids in to see the windows. So we've got all this going on in the middle of the CBD. Bourke Street is the main street of Melbourne, and the area in front of the Maya windows has been converted to a shopping mall, so that the only traffic that goes through are the Melbourne trams and occasional delivery vehicles. January the 20th, a speeding car smashes into the mall, mounts the curb and goes straight into several groups of shoppers in front of the GPO. The photos there are the end result. The driver then starts targeting more pedestrians and he speeds away down Bourke Street, chased by police cars with sirens blazing. Where we were staying was about 10 minutes out of the city. Our daughter Christy works in the Telstra building, and from where she is, she's about a block away from this looking down on what happens. So we phone her, and because we'd heard it on the news, and we said, "Are you okay?" This was lunchtime, and I thought she could well be out amongst those crowds. She's in the office. She says, "Look, we don't know what's going on, but it's something big." She was the warden for her floor, and she said, "I've been instructed we've got to put people in lockdown." And so she was busy doing with that. We at least had the reassurance that we knew she was okay. Well, you would have heard on the news, I don't know whether you still remember, But recently this guy actually was on charges and the court case. Absolute tragedy. It was very deliberate. 6 people died, dozens more were injured, and it left a scar on Melbourne, the main street of our peaceful home city. We were left dazed and distressed. At that stage we packed up, headed home. We didn't know at that stage, but 10 days after that, Dean landed in hospital, not knowing what was wrong. Now, a lot of you will have heard of his journey through being diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. And Dean says, you never want to hear the words acute and leukemia in the same sentence. It was absolute devastation. We were told at that stage he had a 30% chance of recovery. And we were left absolutely dazed. For us, in just over a week, there have been 2 major tragedies. And it's tempting in that sense to give up. But you're stuck in it. You've got 2 choices. You can give up and you can curl up in a ball and try to ignore the world, but the tragedy's still happening around you. Or you can find a way of picking yourself up and keeping going. So how do we do that? Now, let's see if I can get this one working. So these are the 3 questions that I want to ask and look at in this. In the midst of tragedy, in the midst of drought, in the midst of flood, in the midst of personal crisis, where is God? How can you make sense of it? How can you find meaning when your world suddenly changes in such a dramatic way? And how can you actually pick yourself up and move forward knowing that life is never going to be the same again? The families of people who lost someone in that Burke Street tragedy, the scars are still very raw. There were people openly weeping in the courtroom when the culprit was sentenced. We're Christian, and yet these things still happen to us. If I ask each of you what tragedies you've had in your life, I can guarantee that most of you will be able to list at least one. Most of you will be able to list more. So this has been something that I've been grappling with all my life. How do we make sense of this? How do we move on? Personal questions, professional questions, spiritual questions. Car accidents, drought, fire, acts of evil. They can and they do occur to all of us. When these things happen, we've got 2 choices: give up or find a way to keep going. One of the things that I've learned along the way is don't be afraid to listen to what your own experience tells you, and listen for that still small voice of God within this, because that can help you get through. We've had many blessings over our lives, but we've also had our share of tragedies. Now, if I go through some of the things in my story, it'll help you understand. When I was born in the bush, in a country town, spent my first 2 years living in the bush, and I think that would never have changed except for a major tragedy. When I was 2, I lost my older sister to leukemia, and the scars on my family were such that my family never recovered. That meant we had to go back to the city for her treatment, which was all of 6 weeks, really just palliative care until she died. When I was a teenager, my parents separated, and that was a real blow to my faith to make sense of that. And as a young mum with a 2-year-old and a 4-week-old baby, I lost my mother to breast cancer. There's some of the tragedies back in my childhood, let alone things that have happened as an adult. Dean and I together have survived bushfires and floods, serious illnesses, severe business stress, unemployment, time when we were both unemployed and we had 3 children still as dependents, and a number of other tragic, unexpected events. But also along the way we've had so many wonderful things, so many joys, so many blessings that we are just bowled over by. So you have all this happening. You have both. When you, even though you have all these good things in your life, when the life-changing tragedy occurs, you're left asking, how can I keep going? I want everyone to close their eyes for a minute. Think about a time in your life when things were really difficult for you. Have you ever had a time particularly when you felt like you were doing everything right and yet something unthinkable happened? Have you ever felt that God had abandoned you or even questioned whether he existed? If you can say yes to any of those questions, I want you to put your hand up. Now just open your eyes, have a look around, hold your hand up for a minute. Don't be embarrassed, because what you'll see is that most people have their hands up. Thanks for that. Just to prove my point. And particularly if we operate with the lens of focusing on the things that are good in life, it helps us to get through, but we often lose sight of those things. The Bible is filled with examples of tragedies, and I want to run through this really quickly. So if we look at Joseph, he was his father's favourite son, and yet his brothers attacked him, sold him into slavery, told his father that he'd been killed. Number of others there: Job, John the Baptist, James and Peter James was executed, but James and Peter is an interesting story where they were both actually imprisoned at the same time, both absolutely full of promise. James was executed, Peter survived. Now we know a lot about Peter and what Peter went on to do. He wrote half the New Testament. But I often wonder what James might have achieved if he hadn't have been executed. How do you make sense of that injustice? Stephen being stoned. Human nature asks why. Why do these things happen? Why didn't God listen? Why, when I'm doing God's will, can things go drastically wrong? I've come to the conclusion that this is not actually the right question to ask. It's not helpful. And I don't know that, particularly from our human experience, we can actually make sense of that. Hopefully one day we will, but at the moment, no. Jesus claimed that view of God was simplistic. He presented God as a loving God who wants only good for us. There are examples where he healed someone and the disciples asked, why did God actually visit this tragedy on this person? What had this person done wrong? And there are times where Jesus said, well, actually, he didn't do anything wrong. And one time he explains it as this was just actually to glorify God, so I could demonstrate God's power. If that's not the right question, how do we make sense of tragedies when they occur? How do we make sense of the fact that Jesus, in spite of that, said, I've come so that they might have life and have it to the full? It seems to be a contradiction. I don't believe that God brings misfortune on us. That's my personal opinion. I really think that that's a simple response that is not helpful. The Jeremiah passage says, for I know the plans I have of you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. That to me doesn't sound like a vengeful God. That doesn't sound like a God who said, right, you've done something wrong, so I'm going to punish you. Punishment, I think, is a lot more complex than that. And in some ways, the consequences of our actions bring that on ourselves. God is a God of love. When Jesus started his ministry, he stood up in the synagogue and he quoted from Isaiah, and he talked about, he sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of despair. He was about lifting us up and helping us to find joy even within misfortune. We've had our fair share over the years, and I could talk a lot about our own things, but our daughter Bree suggested that I share her story of the last 9 years. And while it's very different to the sorts of things the farmers on the land are experiencing, and different to a lot of people's tragedies, there's so much in it that I think it's like a story of Job, and it is certainly worth sharing because it just helps to make sense of how do we actually get through this. So, on the left there is Bree and Sam at their wedding. The handsome couple in the right-hand corner is Dean and I, and the bottom right corner is Dean with our eldest daughter Christy, who was one of the bridesmaids. Bree married Sam on the 23rd of May 2009. They've just celebrated their 9th anniversary. It was an absolutely beautiful Melbourne autumn day in a beautiful setting in the gardens of a historic home called Ripponlea. Absolutely blessed. If you talk about God's blessing over them, they had 2 Churches of Christ ministers and an Anglican bishop officiating because of links with family. This shows Sam's family. His father Tony on the left, his mother Joan, then Sam, then Bree, and then Sam's 2 brothers as best men. Sam, leading up to the wedding, had been ill and out of work for a while, but was on the improve. In July, short time after they married, they got the news that Bree's company was going to be closed and that she too would be out of work. So that was the start to their married life. It was the start of a saga which really did rival the story of Job. I'm going to do a quick list. I can't possibly tell the whole full story, but a quick list of all the things that they experienced in the first 2.5 years of their married life. In October of that same year, Sam's mother Joan suffered a relapse of the bowel cancer that she'd fought 5 years earlier. And the doctors were saying at that stage she might have 12 months. In December of that year, Dean gets the call to come up and work with Churches of Christ in Queensland, and in March, finally, we relocate up here. And we're actually driving up to Brisbane just before Easter. We arrived, I think, about on Easter Sunday, if I remember correctly. Bree, on the Thursday night, as we're on our drive up here, we get a phone call from Bree. She's in Kununurra, northern Western Australia. She had to go there for work. She hadn't yet, she was still working at this stage. And they'd cancelled the one plane out of Kununurra for the day. She said, Joan's back in hospital and she's really sick and I can't get home. Nothing anyone could do. She had tried every airline and no one was flying out of Kununurra. Finally, she hit Melbourne on the Saturday morning, Easter Saturday, got a taxi from the airport straight to the hospital and arrived in time to console Sam because his mother had died an hour or so earlier. So that was the start of a major tragedy. And we thought this is going to be difficult to deal with. But let me tell you what happened afterwards. A month later, they get an invitation to dinner with Sam's father and his new girlfriend. 3 months later, they get told that his father had remarried. Not invited to the ceremony, got told. You can imagine what that did to the 3 sons. Major family uproar and blow up. The other 2 sons said, there's no way we'll be part of that. They disappeared, cut off contact. To this day, Sam has not spoken to them, and in fact he knows they've moved, he's lost contact with them totally. They're left in this situation not being able to make sense of a new mother-in-law when they haven't even really started grieving Sam's mother. So they're dealing with all that. As a result of that, we find that both Bree and Sam end up with clinical depression, and they're really struggling. At this stage, they're both still out of work, both still trying to find work. Bree eventually finds work, and then sometime later, Sam is able to find work, and they're in a position then, things are looking up. They buy a house. The day of settlement, Bree, who is actually bringing in the most money, is retrenched. 2 months later, Sam is again retrenched. So here they are, their 3rd wedding anniversary. Sam had lost his mother. They're having difficulty coming to terms with a new mother-in-law. His family is totally shattered. We were 1,500 kilometres away and so couldn't provide a lot of support. And they were $500,000 in debt. Their mental health was really rocky. And is it any wonder they kept getting sick with everything that was coming around? So how do you get through all that? Now, I've talked with Bree about that a bit, and obviously we've given what support we could from a distance. It was hard. Doesn't want to go. Aha. This sits on their fridge. It's a tattered piece of paper that has sat there for the last 9 years. Philippians 4, verses 5 to 9. Bree says that this actually was something that she absolutely clung on to get them through the worst times. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guide your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. So that was something that they hung on to. Now, if we unpack that, firstly, background. Peter wrote Philippians when he was in prison, not knowing if he was going to be executed or ever get out again. He wrote it to a church who was undergoing severe persecution. He knew very well the tragedies that they were facing day by day. He's teaching us here 2 rules to follow when faced with tragedy. Now, I also work as a psychologist, and I deal every day with people who are trying to make sense of tragedy. The type of therapy that I use, ACT therapy, fits glove in hand with what we're being taught in Philippians. And I'm going to unpack that as we have a look at this Philippians passage. So, the verse before that, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. How do you rejoice when your world's falling apart? It's a real challenge. And I've had people sit in my office facing me in tears saying, I feel so guilty. I feel such a poor Christian because all these things have happened and yet I'm supposed to be rejoicing. I think, no, that's the wrong way to look at it. I distinguish between the deep joy that is of God and the superficial happiness that the media talks about. The deep joy is this deep certainty that God is with me. And one of the things that I used when Dean was sick and in hospital last year that helped to get me through is this thing that God's got it. And that was my sense of certainty. And it wasn't a sense of certainty that Dean was going to survive and going to be all right, but it was a sense of certainty that God was with me and God was with him. And that regardless of what would happen, walking with God was going to get me through. That's the joy of God. That's the difference. And this is what Paul is saying. It's not about pasting on an artificial smile. It's about connecting with this deep joy while you're still in the midst of sorrow. One of the first things that I'll get my clients to do is to work on keeping a gratitude diary. And this is a really simple thing that anyone can do. But there's research that shows that if you can do this for 6 weeks, it will actually help you find the balance, cope with the tragedy, but also reconnect with that deep joy. So it's quite simple. Each day, 3 things. You need to look for 3 things that make you feel grateful, that you want to say thank you to God for, that makes you smile or makes you laugh. Now, if you're really in the depths of depression, that can be really challenging. And I can remember a time in my life when people would say, oh, but look, you've got all this going for you. You've got a beautiful family. You've got 3 lovely children, a lovely home, a good husband. And I'd be saying, yeah, I know, but that's all, nothing much. I am really struggling. But the more that you focus on that, the more that it can get you through. The more you do that, the more the peace of God will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. What happens psychologically is when we're struggling, our mind becomes a don't get killed machine. It goes into protective mode. So it is constantly scanning for danger. So if I was in that situation now, I'd be looking around the room, looking for anything that might hint that it's going to make life more difficult for me. And it could be, oh, that person over there scowled at me. They think that I'm doing a terrible job or saying the wrong thing. And suddenly I get really anxious. So the idea of the gratitude diary is to write that balance again. Because there might be these things going on that are making life tough. But no matter how tough, there are still things that we can be grateful for. We can step out of this church, look at the blue sky and the sunshine and say, what a lovely day. Thank you, God. I can remember when I was in Sunday school, we used to sing a song called Count Your Blessings. And that's what it's about. There's always things. The challenge is to retrain our mind, to open our eyes to see it. So a challenge for you, if you're struggling with this balance, if you're struggling with things that are piling on top of you and overwhelming you, try it. Every day, 3 different things. And the important thing is not just to notice them, but to either write them down or take photographs and keep a photograph album of them so that they accumulate. And each day you need to find 3 new things. And you will find it, if you're in that state, you can find it really difficult for the first few days, the first week. But the more you go, the easier it gets. And then in times when you're in the depths of despair, you open up your diary, you open up your photo album, and just carefully, mindfully look at each thing. Spend some time dwelling in it. Remember you when you were back there and you just had this glimpse of appreciation and gratitude and joy for this thing. And it will help pull you out of that. So this is what Paul says in verse 8. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think on it. That's gratitude. That's counting your blessings. When I was discussing this with Bree, she wrote to me, this particular verse was a huge help to remind me to focus on the good parts of the world amongst it all, to cultivate a willful appreciation and focus on the beauty around us despite everything that was going on. A tasty sandwich, a beautiful flower, acts of small kindnesses, etc. A side effect of this is that now I'm more than ever moved to emotion by art, music of different types. Bree and I flew up to Cairns a couple of months ago and we walked the Thorsburn Trail on Hinchinbrook Island. And Bree, in her state of mind, was absolutely overwhelmed by the beauty of it. I had to laugh because the first day she just kept saying, "Oh, this is so beautiful. This is so beautiful." And it was about immersing yourself in that beauty of the world and in the beauty of life, in the joy of creation. Bree said, I learned a new word last week, duendi. The spirit of evocation. She says it's a flamenco term. It comes from inside as a physical, emotional response to art. It's what gives you chills, makes you smile or cry as a bodily reaction to an artistic performance that's particularly expressive. You can imagine the flamenco dancers expressing music with their full body and their soul, putting everything they've got into it. Bree's got a background as a dancer, so that particular imagery meant something to her. No matter what's going on with you, the beauty is there. It's still there. It will always be there. It's just that our minds have stopped registering it. We can feel the tragedy of the brown paddocks, of the trickle of water that used to be a thriving dam that was supporting a whole population of birds and wildlife. But within that, there's beauty too. I've seen some amazing photographs of things like the patterns that are formed from the dried out earth and the way that the earth is cracked. There's still the beauty of the blue sky. There's still the beauty of relationships and connectedness with other people that's there despite it all. Bree would often look at everything that had happened and she'd say to me, you know what, Mum, we've been through so much in the last couple of years. I reckon it's a test. Our marriage, if we can get through all that, our marriage can survive everything. She was finding there the gold nugget, the element of joy within multiple tragedies. So this is Paul's first message to the Philippians, to rejoice even in the midst of despair. And this is the second one. Let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers, letting God know your concerns, taking it to God. Paul's not promising that God will make our problems disappear. We don't have to live for very long to know that that's not right. And anyone who does believe that, I think, has a Pollyanna view of the world. But Paul does promise that a sense of God's wholeness will give you strength. I often used to pray handing over my burdens. And I'd say, please, God, take these burdens, take them off me because I can't handle them. It took me a long time to realise why I didn't necessarily feel this sense of peace. It's because I'm going, here's my burdens. You can take them, but I'm going to hang on to them too. And so I end up in this tug of war with God. I don't trust you to let go of them completely. I don't trust you to let them sit with you. I've got to have some control over this as well. But as a result, I'm carrying around those burdens the whole time. And that anxiety weighs me down and stops me getting on with the positive things, the differences that I can make in life, because I won't let go of my burdens. It's only when I can really let go and leave a problem with God that I can find peace. In ACT therapy, we talk about this as acceptance and expansion. No amount of fighting or hiding from issues will change them. If things have gone wrong, then we can't change it no matter how hard it is to deal with. They have happened, it's past history. But we can recognise and acknowledge the pain and hurt. It's not about ignoring it. It's about making room for it, but expanding so that we can actually travel around it, that we've got this pain in there, and yes, we've got this pain, but you know, if we can expand our world to travel around it, to focus on what am I here for? What's my purpose? How can I make a difference in the world, even though all this stuff is happening to me? Then we can actually find that balance and we can find a reason to keep going. And it really can reshape the way that we see it. The aim is not to get rid of the pain, but the aim is to find a way of accepting the pain. But ironically, usually, if we can actually do that successfully, we find that the pain does diminish, and so it's easy to move forward. Not always, but most times. So this question of why did this happen, there's no easy answer. When I'm in the midst of tragedy and wanting to ask this question, I'm usually too close to make sense of it. But later, often a lot later, when I step back from the disaster and I can take a helicopter view, I can actually see stuff that was happening in there. I can see God working in me through that time. And I am not saying, I absolutely want to say, I am not saying that God visits tragedies on us because we've got to learn a lesson. But I do really believe that God takes advantage of those tragedies to help us to learn and to grow and to find new opportunities and new directions. Dean and I were talking about this at breakfast this morning, and he expressed it that as a roadblock sign, that I'm coming along this road and then there's a closed road sign. Oh, I've got to find another way round. So instead of that, I turn left and I go that way. Now, eventually, if I follow the detour around, I'll end up back on that road, and sometimes that happens. But sometimes in following that detour, we actually find a better way to go. And we end up somewhere totally different and totally unexpected. And that's happened to both Dean and I a few times in our lives. Stuff that would never have happened if we hadn't have met that roadblock. So that's some of what can happen. The Serenity Prayer there actually sums all this up. So what can I do? Acceptance and expansion and acceptance, as I talked about, and count your blessings. If I look at Bree and Sam, they're both different people now from when they're married, very different. There's grief and sadness that's still with them over the loss of Sam's mother, and it's easy to touch if you talk about it, and the loss of his family. But through practicing acceptance and gratitude, they've found peace and they've reconnected with joy. And Brie and I can have this wonderful time together where she can absolutely appreciate our relationship, appreciate what's around us. And it's brought Brie and Sam closer. The tough stuff has given them deeper wisdom, deeper resilience and greater empathy. And they're rebuilding their relationship with Sam's father. The relationship is different. It'll never be what it was. But they're learning to understand each other in a new space, and there's healing taking place, and that's really good to see. They've learnt that they can rely on each other, that they can trust each other regardless of what life throws at them, and that's actually a real gold nugget in it. Their compassion for others is now based on their real experience. It's not an academic thing. And so they're much better equipped to help each other, other people. Does this justify their pain and what they've been through? No. But it does help them to move forward, and it helps them to accept the past. They can celebrate some positives that have come out of a really tough time in life. If you think back to Joseph, the story of Joseph, if you've never done it, find the start of the story in Genesis and read through the whole story. We tend to get confronted with a bit of Joseph's story at different times. But if you read through the whole lot, it's interesting to see God being with Joseph through all that, through so many ups and downs of tragedies, the highs and the lows. Every time things were going well, something brought him down. But one day, Joseph's brothers come seeking food to survive the family, to survive their drought, because they were facing starvation. The family is reunited. Joseph brings them all to Egypt, and in doing so, he rescues them from salvation and he saves the Jewish race to continue on with God's story. There is always something there if we can endure and we can get through. Thank you.